as Bridget mentioned, I will talk for about 40 minutes, and I tend to cover a wide gamut of references and stories and maybe ideas that flow in and out. I don't have a prepared speech, so I talk fairly improvisationally. And also leading up to this talk, one of the things I was thinking is how the context of where something is shown, how the work is viewed, and changes or, well, initially it feels like it changes, but in a more positive note, I think it draws out content that sometimes feels latent or not talked about. So what I'm really excited about in relationship to this talk is to maybe show images that I often do show, but I gloss over because just the context doesn't necessarily bring up those ideas. And being Indian American, somebody who moved here when I was a kid and studied here, primarily in my kind of later education from high school and college and so on, my relationship to painting and image making and personal history and art history is some of it does not link up directly with what maybe a viewer wants to find in the work when they see my name. On the other hand, there's information in here that is probably quite obvious if you have, which I'm going to somewhat assume a bit more understanding and nuanced understanding of a cultural space that I'm working from. So also feel free, if you want me to kind of linger on a painting or an image a little bit longer and speak further, feel free to bring that up or speak out. I don't mind being interrupted. And of course, you can ask me questions later on. All the work I'm going to show is going to be paintings and then photography, images that I take as part of my almost a visual journal. And the paintings are similarly made to the ones downstairs. They're all on canvas and some on paper, but nothing too crazy happening with that part of the equation. So I want to start with maybe how I got into painting or why. Though it's hard to say when. Somebody asked me, somebody was here with their daughter on Friday, and she was asking when I started painting, like very pointedly, like when did you start painting? And I think it's more that I don't remember ever not painting or drawing. There's a photo of me, which I'll show later, sitting on the floor drawing, and if I look carefully, I can tell what I'm drawing, which I'll bring up a bit later too. So my relationship to the visual imagery and looking and drawing has always been connected. I remember, so quickly, left image is a window, ironwork, in Kolkata, where I grew up, the room basically I used to look out from. I remember looking out and during floods and seeing and dropping paper, boats in there and seeing my uncle kind of go across, trudge through that. And then the bottom image is half of a metal gate. Part of it my dad designed for the house I grew up in. So, these photos I take or have taken, every, so many years that I go back, that I've been back since our family moved here. My dad lives here in Arizona. I live in New York. All our extended families in India. So the trips back, they do feel like jumps in time because, but these images will come back and they have a different meaning to me now than perhaps they did when I was a kid. So maybe there are three ways I can talk about how I get into painting or what I look for, and it has a lot to do with part of it is painting. It's unavoidable for me. I remember growing up, not necessarily with the history of painting. I didn't go to museums, but more that I was surrounded by images, and I was always looking at images or kind of visualizing images from my grandfather telling me a story or me reciting poetry, that's a big thing for Bengalis. Having to like memorize entire Rabindranath Tagore poems and reciting them, and and there's a certain way you do that. So imagery for me has a lot to do with a kind of continuity and being part of life. The other part of, and the way the imagery of painting, the world of painting links up for me, there's two other kind of sets. One of them is kind of the daily, everyday, almost banal aspect of life, and then also the mythic. So I'm going to talk a bit about references. And maybe one way I think about references is how one image or one kind of a story gives you a little cue or a visual aesthetic kind of echo into the world. Perhaps one way I can very generally say what I do is I feel that my paintings exist or try to parse out a space that is about the middle, that is about a kind of space that is liminal, that is in a way intersects different kind of points of focus, but tries to expand the space of the middle. I don't think it's a space that's comfortable culturally, historically, politically, and because we're always in a way kind of answers are so much more comforting, right? Like to know there is a resolution to something. But I think for artists, maybe, or the type of artist I am, it's the drawing out of the middle and being in it. When people ask me how long something takes me to finish, like how long did this painting take to finish? Was it 1 month? Was it 2 weeks? One thing I often mention is I rarely think about how long it takes something, because what I'm trying to do is work on the painting, because that's the space that is the most important, like to be there. If I was thinking about finishing something, it just kind of ruins the whole the meal. It's like having an amazing meal and trying to be done with it. Like, why would you do that? That's crazy. Like, you want to enjoy the food, right? And so food is a big part of my interaction. I think food analogies are, just great. I mean, who doesn't love food? So the reason I'm showing this is kind of, if you can see the kind of latent imagery of gestures, on the left of Krishna and Radha, on the right, it's a painting by the Spanish painter Francisco de Goya, self-portrait with Dr. Arrieta. When the longer I've painted and the longer I've been involved with imagery, I look for these echoes. And I remember, and for me, the type of artist I am, it hasn't been a linear progression of sources. And, I remember when I was a graduate student, and I think this is just a byproduct of who we are, but I think it's getting more sensitive. I think people are becoming more sensitive to this kind of that we make assumptions about who we are and our histories, and based on kind of a generalized cultural space that we seem to occupy. There might be some truth to it, because all stereotypes come from some level of incidence, but on the other hand, I think, life is a bit more complicated than that. So, it's weird for me to say this, but I think my interest in kind of the historical aspects of Indian painting did not come out of me being a painter or being Indian American or anything like that. It was kind of a backwards entry point. Like, I remember having a teacher in undergrad who was making these paintings. He was was he Swedish? I think he was Swedish. He's Swedish American, like second generation. And he was making these paintings that looked very much like small versions of Richard Diebenkorn paintings, like the American painter. And I was like 18, I was a soft freshman, and I just like bluntly said, "Oh, you must really like Diebenkorn." And I remember this glare I got, like these, and I remember him saying, like, I don't think he ever got mad at me. That was one time I saw like this little spark of anger and frustration, and he was like, "These have nothing to do with Diebenkorn." Fast forward 10 years, I realized that he had this extended relationship to Korean art, to traveling to both Japan and Korea, working with artists and artisans bringing pigment back, just kind of really learning from the inside out. And as much as he was an outsider in many ways, he felt a certain connection. And I remember going to his studio in Maine a few years before he passed away, and he had built this studio that was just like elevated about like foot and a half from the ground. So when you walked in, it really felt like that space was floating, and you could tell that had a lot to do with the kind of headspace that he was working from. So the reason I'm saying this is because I remember when I was a undergrad going to Italy for the first time as part of a program, the university has the European Honors Program, and not really being interested in this kind of dramatic painting, but kind of falling in love with a painting like the one on the right by Fra Angelico, this kind of small, intimate painting where these images, I didn't really necessarily come at it from obviously a religious point of view, but just kind of really becoming interested in how color was being used, how design was working. I felt almost a natural affinity for a kind of underlying architecture that was in that work. And then that, in a way, giving me an entry point into like a painting from the left. So that for me has really continued. The left over here is a detail of a Mughal miniature, death of Khan Jahan Lodi, and on the right, it's it's a detail from a large fresco by Piero della Francesca in Arezzo. Both of them depict people being killed, and that is intentional on my part that I'm showing this. But the other part of that has to do with a type of almost calm detachment. And I remember looking at these paintings in person, both the painting on the left, which the Met owns, and was part of an exhibition. It's been part of two exhibitions, actually, and I remember getting up close and looking at them. And then the one on the right, it's like a large cycle that you're standing and you're looking up and you're kind of craning your neck. And I think that this, to me, leads into the role of architecture for me, or the sense of place. And to me, that's somewhat complicated because I'm not an architect. I'm not really interested in, architecture, or has never been interesting in terms of like me wanting to be an architect. But what I am interested in is how we as people interact with the world when we're aware of our surroundings. And I remember going up the steps in San Marco in Florence, looking at that painting. And while this is an image it's a fresco, so it's on the wall, it's not going anywhere. Something about when you're going up steps and coming down the steps, there is a kind of regeneration, almost like a refresh, that an image refreshes when you refresh your monitor. That it's another opportunity to interact, another opportunity to look out the window, another opportunity to decide which way you're going to go. So there's a temporality relationship to architecture that I'm interested in, and sometimes that temporality is literal in the sense that during I was mentioning earlier, during Durga Puja, which is something that I used to look forward to every year as a kid, I would go with my uncles and my father to some of the major kind of neighborhoods to see, and I would just sit on the floor and draw. But I think, and that was a big part of my entry point into painting, which is it had everything. It had like stories, it had drama, it had figures. I think that's how I learned how to draw the figure, actually, just drawing, Durga and Lakshmi and everybody else in the consortium. But also. Here, there's me drawing. The comics, which were, I used to collect these like crazy. But also the fact that, these incredible temporal structures are built really, for the duration of a week or 10 days, and then they come back down, and these elements are cycled, recycled, reused, and every year each neighborhood tries to outdo themselves and also their neighboring, so there's this kind of battle going on. Some of these, as they've, I haven't been to a Durga Puja in years now, like over 10 years, at least in Kolkata. But that to me, the reason I bring that up is because the fact that this whole room, this incredible Colosseum-like space is being built for this 10 days, and that people coming in are both marveling at this superstructure, but it's also a place of worship and intimacy, and almost bigger than ourselves. That to me is kind of amazing, that a space can do that. So the reason I bring that up is because, like, for me, I'm not. So this painting is in the show downstairs, and actually does directly relate it partially to the story of Durga and Mahishasur. The image refers to Mahishasur Murdini, and but also on the left is a more prosaic and a kind of a everyday aspect of a figure putting together something. But I do think what I've taken from these types of experiences is that I like the idea, or it's inevitable that my paintings end up like images that on one hand have a incredible graphic quality to them, but on the other hand they have what I always use the phrase like a slow bleed, where the information, the content, the suggestibility, everything kind of slowly leaks out, in the sense that and I mentioned this on Friday as well, that I'm very much a proponent of painting being a space where questions are met with questions, fragments interact, and you're asked to linger. You're asked to kind of hang on and just kind of be there. And so this kind of initial mythic aspect in relationship to the slow bleed has a lot to do with how I also think about my life and the things when I leave that kind of ethereal, almost epic headspace of storytelling and mythology and history. It has to do with the everyday. It has to do with me, looking out a kitchen window on the right. That's like a really kind of not the best quality image which is intentional, through these bamboo in our backyard at twilight, or the image on the left, a place my family and I go every summer for a little bit in the San Juan Islands. And so this kind of light that almost recurs in my work. And I've realized that something about twilight, the reason it returns, is not so much that as a color I'm drawn to it, or a romantic idea necessarily, but the fact that during that time our eyes can't really fully gauge distance. It's a time when time does get trapped, that day and night does coexist. And so there's that kind of liminal space again in terms of light and time that we try to hold on to. And sometimes it lasts half an hour, sometimes 10 minutes, depending on the time of the year. So this thing that happens when you're looking is that you try to make out something in the world that you've known has been there, but it's taking you a lot longer to figure those things out. So these are two smaller paintings of mine from a while ago that I'm showing, that in different ways I've gone back to this idea of trying to make sense of the world, and trying to latch on to a condition that I can't fully even make out. So the painting on the left, I'll just quickly say, like when people ask what it was me looking out of a window, but looking as far as I could see and trying to find, if it was like an information the size of a pin, and trying to expand that into a painting. It's like if you imagine a digital example would be if you take an image and you start zooming in, it becomes more and more pixelated. But if you're looking, images the world doesn't become pixelated. The world just transforms. It just changes. So there is ultimate, almost infinite resolution, but within that space, there is a type of a transformation or alteration that happens, that often people look at the painting on the left and they say, oh, is that the moon? And it's not the moon, first of all, in a literal sense, but the question of that you want to believe that it's the moon, to me is very interesting, and I enjoy that it has that transformative quality. I'm going to skip past these two images really quickly, but maybe the one thing I'll say is take a look at these in relationship to maybe how I structure some of the paintings. One thing I can say is a type of network. Like architecture as a network, as a, whether you're thinking about on the left, I always think of this as the most analog version of a computer motherboard, where every part has type of function. This is Dhobi Ghat in Mumbai. And on the right, it's kind of a section of a wall near temple grounds, where the entire wall is built out of fragments of the temple at earlier times, with new stones, kind of almost like a functional collage of sorts. So the reason I'm showing these two is to kind of link it to some paintings that I've done over the course of time. When Bridget initially, when we were talking about the show, I tend to look at my work in a few different areas. Some of them, the larger works often are, I think of them as stagings. And then there's another group, I think of them as reconstructions. And these link up with that second category, which I'm going to actually lead with after a few of these, in the sense that they are, in many ways, the paintings don't begin with a source that exists in the world, which is different than to say that, if you go and you look for things in the world, everything has a kind of loaded functional meaning to them. But for me, what I'm interested in is to start with something that has been manipulated, that may relate back to the world somehow. Like, so this image is a painting that is also a variation of Durga, or the iconic image of Durga slaying the demon, and the buffaloes in the bottom and everything. But the other part of that has to do with me walking. I remember walking down the street one day and noticing kind of in the Lower East Side, these hexagonal stone sidewalk had kind of broken, and they were doing some kind of street work on there, so their cones placed and all these hexagonal pieces were broken. I remember looking at that and coming home and then noticing some cracks in our bathroom floor, which is tiled, which also has hexagonal like mini tiles, and thinking that there's something that I wanted to play with. So I basically built this collage, mounted that on a foam core that then got cut into hexagonal pieces, rejoined and broken again. So I'm telling you a very literal progression of how this painting began, but a big part of that has to also do with trying to access both a physical sensation and a condition that's in my daily experience, while trying to also locate myself or think about something that that is a big part of my, I suppose, autobiography and storytelling intentions. Here's another one. So when I talk about also this idea of the middle, maybe one thing I always am looking for, or in my paintings, or I go back to sometimes intentionally, other times I find myself there, is the relationship to language, which is as many of you know, if you speak more than one language, and if you had to learn it at some point, the second one that is not the one you grew up with, if you start dreaming in it, there is you realize you have a much more nuanced understanding of that language, that you are really kind of thinking through that language. But the other way to think about language for me has to do with trying to make a decision that if there are two truths that are real, that kind of shifting between those two truths becomes interesting, in the sense that this is a painting of strips of paper on printouts of paper. It's painting of paper on top of paper. But the other truth of this is that these are white lines on top of an interior. The other truth of that is this is a conversation with all over abstraction in terms of the history of at least American painting. And so in that way, there's a kind of there's this layered conversation that's happening throughout the work. It's interesting. I haven't thought about this a lot, but it's funny how you're always connected to your parents in some ways, right? So my dad designs the the platforms, everything really, before the idols get moved in, for Durga Puja in Phoenix. So every year he'll come up with designs for them. He often uses foam core and has some people helping him, and they're huge. They're made in pieces and kind of constructs them. He comes from a design background, even though he's not a designer. He's a kind of business, engineering, kind of that's where he went into. On the other hand, what I have found myself doing more and more is kind of reconstructing a world and then using that as a reference point for my painting. So I've never thought about this in such a kind of a parallel autobiographical way, but we both tend to build things as a entry point for another transformation. So when I first started some of my earlier work, I had a studio in Baltimore where I used to live, and I would take an entire room and transform it. I would make the wallpaper, I would bring in furniture, I would hire models for paintings that I would make, as almost like a stage set that would exist as a way to make a painting. So the narrative or storytelling would be embedded in the event. What I do now is, which began a few years ago, one, because of space issues, wonders of New York, and secondly, because I felt that I needed a little bit more distance from myself and my world, the working space, and the world that I was playing with, kind of mining. So I remember walking down the street, and this is before we had a kid, and my wife saw a small, dollhouse on the side of the road, and she looked at me, she's like, "You want that, don't you?" I'm like, "Yeah." So, I went and got the car and loaded it up, and I think she had to fend off like 3 families with triple wide strollers because it's Brooklyn and everyone has like 6 kids, seems like, which is weird. I don't know what that's about. But I'm like, where do you live? So anyway, it started that way, and it was incredibly freeing because it just kind of opened things up for me. And so this idea of a room becoming a stage and a stage becoming a room, this kind of conversation happening, opened up a lot of the work that are downstairs. And one thing I often think about, I've talked about painting, and I kind of glossed over a couple, still shots of films, but literature is important to me, definitely, but, and specific types of literature, especially kind of more imaginative and almost dreamlike storytellers. So whether it's Gabriel Garcia Lopez or Murakami or Borges, and specifically someone like Borges, the one story I always think about, is called The Other, where the author as a character meets himself. One part of him, one element of the conversation is somebody who's in their 20s or not even 20, and the other one, I believe, is in his 70s, and they're both trying to talk to each other, trying to kind of suss out who is real. So they each give examples of why that character is more real and the other one is an imagination or a dream. And that duality and that the whole story is about that conversation of these two parts, almost not fighting, but it's almost like a dance, trying to work themselves out. I think is just, to me, that's painting. That's what happens. Okay, so let's jump. So these reconstructions that I bring up often have a lot to do with figuring out how something is made, or why do you make a painting. And for me, painting happens, or paintings exist, not because there's an image beforehand that needs to be made, but more from the point of view that something didn't happen, that you had an idea but it didn't work. And so now what do you do? So this idea of a false answer, or that something that was intended didn't work out, so now you actually have to deal with the problem differently. That to me is endlessly fascinating, and for me, painting is a way to access that space, and in myself, and in a way also be in conversation with the world of painting. So these two paintings are what I call, as well as this painting, are paintings that I call paintings that come out of erasure and mistakes. Meaning, you make a painting or you make an image that you think is the painting, and which doesn't work. So in turn, you start covering up parts of it, trying to resuscitate, almost give it a new life. And through that process, you come up with an image that you didn't expect to have. And what it also does, the actual condition of that transformation, which in this case was to take a painting, cover it with paper and tape to try to elicit another type of an image out of it, brought on another type of conversation. So, or this one, I remember coming in one day to my studio, the painting was leaning against the floor and the light was kind of cutting through from the window, creating these diamond shapes, and me looking at it and thinking, that's the painting. So this idea of surprise and realizing that how you end the journey sometimes is not prescribed from the beginning when you feel like you have a roadmap. So do I like getting lost? I would say no. But do I find that it's useful to how I end up or where I have ended up as the type of artist I am? I would say absolutely. And sometimes it's about a conversation with a part of yourself. I've been talking a lot about the everyday, perhaps, and then mythology and storytelling, and that battling itself out within myself. But the other part of it is simply knowing who you are, or trying to trust an aspect of yourself, which is, in this case, looking at a drawing I did a couple of years ago and trying to imagine what that can become in a painting, like the one on the bottom right. Or in this case, looking at a painting and realizing that beginning the painting was the painting, that what I thought I wanted to do needed to be quieted down. So, this idea of slowing down, which I bring up a lot about painting, it has a lot to do, in some ways it's also about understanding who I am and how I see the world. So on the left here in the two photos, one is through a small restaurant in Aurangabad, and on the right, Jahangir Palace in Orcha. And, these images I showed earlier. So that kind of idea of network, of layering, of screens, as a way to kind of hold together this idea of duality, of doubling, and that you suddenly have this little inkling into another space. But it's that you are asked to kind of stay there. And so when I mentioned this idea of the middle and wanting to be in the middle, it's not so much about anxiety, but more about just being comfortable with that fact that the middle does offer a lot. That can be a place of sustenance and ideas and exploration. One thing I've noticed with some of the newer paintings that are downstairs and conversations I had on Friday, but even before, I remember when I was making these paintings, that instead of people asking, why I made something or asking for a story, that they would often bring up these fragments that they felt like they saw. It's almost like someone seeing a ghost or a shadow and trying to figure out if that actually happened. Like, did they actually see that? And so this idea of shadows or contours or silhouettes that exist in some of the paintings downstairs are important, because to me that is also a place where information or content is within the image, but it's also in our own heads. Like, we ascribe meaning based on what we think is filling out that form, and often there's a lot of obvious bias, ideas about our own sense of trust and fears and accessibility that's wrapped up in that. And I'm interested in those things because I feel like that's a big part of my own development as a person, but also how the kind of interaction I felt I was often entering into as an artist, as a painter, as an immigrant, all of those types of things. A question I often think about, which I don't have a direct answer to. I'm going to skip past a few of these things really quickly as I'm saying this. I remember in grad school, someone asking me this question about why don't I directly engage my heritage, which is always a fun question to deal with when in grad school. And I think that question is a loaded question, but I think it's also kind of is a problematic question that kind of posits a type of neutrality, right? It's like no one, that is becoming more and more obvious in cultural spaces in the world, where what is seen as default, what is seen as a default culture, what is seen as a default language, what is seen as a default place to work from, so that everything else operates as the other, and it's the responsibility of the other to explain why you're doing something, but not the other way around. And that I've always kind of fought that conversation. Like I'm not going to do that, or at least not in the way that is expected of me to do that. And in turn, for me, what's more interesting is to take the language that is, in a way, simultaneously I guess my art birthright or painting birthright, or what I've worked out of, and kind of upend those conversations and to take them to a place that is not perhaps expected. So this kind of leads me to the last set of images I'm going to show, which has to do with kind of bringing together the performative, the everyday, the storytelling, but also these kind of genres, or how painting has always existed, right? Paintings tell stories. Paintings have people. They have places. They have objects. They are, you go to a museum and you find an urn and you concoct a narrative around that element, or a small comb, or a doll, or a toy that a child might have used in, whether it's in kind of, early Greece or Mohenjo-daro or wherever. And so to me, these types of elements become powerful. And so for a while, the paintings downstairs, what precedes them are paintings like this, where I was taking objects from everyday situation, and I showed this one earlier, and transforming them and giving them a different function, removing their actuality and trying to kind of present them slightly differently. The other part of that was to take media, to take images that we expect in the world in a certain way. Like a photograph exists as a photograph, but what if a photograph doesn't exist as a photograph, but a projection based around the scale of what we imagine? So if you're going to look at a room, if you look at a photograph of a room, you see a room, but how big is the room really? And so to project that room into the size that it actually existed in another space changes it again. So there's a kind of collapsing and a kind of compressing happening with a lot of these paintings as they've developed, of genres, like to take something that feels like, a room, but then wrap it within the shape of a head. Or is that a tree? Or to take something that feels like a room, but within the room, what starts at the top feels like a tree, but the way it ends, you feel like you see a body, or there's a kind of a gracefulness to those conditions. Staircases removed from structures, chairs flipped upside down or removed half of it, a table leg existing as an arrow. So these kinds of almost taking something and removing part of the sentence. I often make this allusion with my painting, or the way I think about painting, which is, could painting, if one way to talk about the life is to say, I woke up, I went to the store, I bought some things, I came home, etc., 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 and then I came back from work, had dinner, went to bed, repeat. That's one way to think about our lives, right? Like this kind of daily procession of events that often generalize and becomes kind of a routine. But another way to perhaps look at it is, you woke up, you went to the store was closed. So you crossed the street, and then you found a cat. So in the sense that a series of events at the end of the day do feel linear. We exist in time. On the other hand, they are all based around situations and decisions, some under our control, some we planned, and maybe perhaps many we didn't. And every time you have a conversation with someone, there is a potential condition that something will happen that you didn't plan for. And a monologue is always easier and is all about control. And a dialogue, there is a certain sense of openness, vulnerability there. So these 4 images, by the way, that I'm showing you are multiple stages, or chronological stages for about 6 months of the painting on the right that you're looking at. And so as I'm talking about this idea of going to the store kind of anecdote, I feel that way. I feel that's kind of how I work and how I think. skip past a few of these. And I'll end with maybe the last few images that are downstairs. The painting over here, which relates actually to this painting, and which is not in the show, but this painting actually preceded the painting below, which is called, what is that called? Coming Through. And this is called Starburst. And another companion piece. This piece is called You Go Your Way and I'll Go Mine, which is actually, if you know, comes from a Dylan song. And so, if you notice in this one, the figure is coming back slightly, you know, or the reference to the figure. I remember I was working on this painting for a long time, for a long time, this figure that's over here, I call it a figure, and this figure over here on the left, they were both kind of coexisted, and I was thinking of them as these Siamese characters, Siamese twins or brothers or siblings and such. And the whole painting was about this cross, this variability. I look at this painting in many ways as a self-portrait, and at the end, I feel like I had to make a decision of who was going to kind of end the day. So I remember kind of making this move, making this line that kind of extended outward, which kind of stopped. There's a kind of a stopping point right there. This painting, and then finally I'll end with a couple images. This painting over here, which is below, and then this painting, which is called Wall. These two are the most recent paintings, and maybe seeing the progression of the work, you've developed a kind of, you probably can sense that I'm comfortable in multitudes and multiples and a lot. Like I love the idea of balancing and trying to hold together or juggling a lot of different types of information, maybe even the way I talk. But more recently, I've been thinking about the space we create as artists, as people, for others, right? And I feel like while it is important sometimes to be autobiographical and to talk about our lives or to bring up ideas that are important to us, sometimes what happens in the space that is opposite, what happens in the area where that you did not choose, like the road not taken. So these two recent paintings are, in a way, an attempt or an exploration to deal with emptiness, but not emptiness as a void, but emptiness as being full and rich. I'm thinking a lot about, like how it feels like if you're outside in the woods at nighttime and you hear crickets and you know everything's there, but maybe there are no lights. I remember a few years ago when I was in McDowell, I remember it's so pitch black in New Hampshire. And I would just remember going from dinner to where I was staying through a path. It would freak me out every time. And, I had a little night light that I would flash. But it was creepy. I felt like I was like, a character in like a horror movie that I'm like, this is the last walk. There it is. Like call my wife like, I'm leaving dinner. I'll call you when I get to my bedroom. Yeah.
I have a question about that.
Oh, yeah?
Like that experience that you had, that you're describing right now, you're in nature, or you're in the nature, and now you go back to the studio and you take that experience and you freeze it, or you compound it into this thing that has its own identity that people can appreciate from like the comfort of their own home.
Right.
You take something so specific, and then you just compound it later into something very different. Yet, I guess you're trying to recreate the experience in some way, and maybe not consciously, but maybe.
Well, I mean, part of it is, of course, I think it's conscious. I think for me, I think it's a layered answer, but I do think. Okay, so what I don't believe is I don't think a painting is flat. So
you're a 2D guy. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but I don't believe paintings are flat. What I mean by that, just like I don't believe a book is, if a book has 363 pages, I don't think that's the duration of the book. I don't think a movie that's 2 hours long is 2 hours long. I don't think time exists within us in the same way. We live in time, but time is in many ways is non-linear. And for what I see as being the type of artist I am, what I'm very much interested in is playing with time, is slowing things down and speeding it up, so you're not sure how long you have actually been there. I mean, I love movies that you feel like you've seen, and it was only an hour and a half, but it felt like it was 5 hours. And that to me, it's crazy. Like, how does that happen? And I think it has to do with intervals. It has to do with what is seen and what is actually perhaps intimated in the work. So I'm going to stop with this image, or these sets of images. So I've been talking a little, of course, about, slowing down, which is a perfect transition. And in 2013, there was a conference at the Harvard Initiative of Learning and Teaching. It's called HILT for short. And art and art history professor Jennifer Roberts did a talk and was talking a lot about this deceleration, and making a case as a historian for the role of deceleration in younger generations, in current students coming through, people developing. Like, I have students who are much more intuitively kind of connected to digital interfaces more than analog interfaces, who have drawn and work with the computer faster than they write on paper. Like, they have horrible penmanship, let's just put it that way. And they can't spell sometimes, which is a whole separate issue. But trying to make a case for what happens when you're really asked to slow down. So she has this project that, when I was reading about it, I realized that I do a lot with my students, which is take them to a museum, ask them to sit down and just look, not talk to anybody. And I do a variation of what she does, which asks them to just stay there for as long as they want, and then walk for about 10 or 15 minutes, to the end. So if you're at the Met or National Gallery or museum over here, you just walk, just take a nice walk to the end, and then you sit down, and then you try to write down everything you remember, everything that you remember, what was around it. And it's a fascinating experience. And if you do it in different intervals, I do it in terms of asking them to write everything down as metaphors without describing actually what is there. So if there was a tree in the painting, you can't say there was a tree. You have to say there was maybe something organic, something of the world that kind of had this type of a shape. So you kind of have to work around things. On the other hand, to be very kind of didactic, to write down literally what you remember. Some people have better memory than others. So that to me is very interesting, because it's a way to kind of reposition yourself, to kind of reframe that experience that you thought was going to be about one thing. Oh yeah, I'm going to go look at this painting, or I'm going to go have a cup of coffee. But to kind of parse those moments out. And I feel like chefs do this all the time. When I listen to chefs talk about things, they're constantly talking about how do you take this thing that's going to go in your mouth, this flavor, and how do you just kind of shift it, just kind of nuance it. No, it needs a little bit more of this. No, it needs a little bit more of that. And it's only through the repetition of doing it over and over and over again that you begin to kind of come up with something that probably will last about 30 seconds. But that 30 seconds could be the most amazing aspect. That 30 seconds could change the next 3 years, the next 10 years. And to me, that's what painting does, or can do, or has the power to do. And so this quote to me is amazing. I remember when I first read this. And what you're looking at, if you're familiar with Hokusai's work, is obviously all the iterations that exist from the very beginning, the top one, and then, of course, the last one, which is in his 80s, that exists as any kind of merchandisable product in any major museum, from mug to a T-shirt to a satchel. But beyond that, what I find fascinating, having this kind of incredibly long life that he had and made so much work under so many pseudonyms and et cetera, is the fact that what he takes control of at the end existed all along, but he didn't know it, and it was really because he kept at it and he kept coming back to it. There's this kind of circular nature to his own enterprise that allowed him the room to kind of really slowly kind of harness these thoughts. And for me as an artist, that's what I'm interested in, so when you look at the work downstairs, some of the work might seem very cohesive, quote unquote, are connected aesthetically and in terms of material, and the pieces in the smaller room might seem initially somewhat detached. But if you look at them, there's a kind of an underlying, maybe perhaps what my hope is, a tenor, a thread that's running through them of simultaneity, of kind of a density, a kind of compressed density, exploration with almost different way of moving the hand from being very close to being very far away. And in some cases, making a choice to kind of shift more into a kind of a here and now space as opposed to a space where it just does feel kind of eternal and and timeless and maybe dimensionless. Thank you. So I went a bit longer than 40 minutes, I apologize, but I would love to take any questions. Yes?
This time thing that you were speaking, your understanding of time, it brings two questions to mind. One is, do you stop working on a piece or do you finish it? And the other thing is, where does the name come in? When does
do I stop working on a piece or do I finish it? I like that. I like the way you phrase those, the kind of bifurcated way something does end eventually. I think I stop. I think I tend to favor towards the stop. I can tell when a painting is getting close to being done. I can kind of feel it. It has a different kind of an energy. It's almost like it has a persona. It has a character. And I find that I'm much more hesitant to register my own kind of thoughts on it because I've kept moving. I'm thinking about different things every day, but the painting takes on kind of a crescendo and then suddenly I feel like it's aware, like it exists. It has a place, it has a name, and that's where name comes in. Names come in at a point when I'm like, oh yeah, that's where it is, or that's who it is, or that's when it is.
That's kind of the stopping time.
Yes, yeah. When if I had to kind of make a graph, I would probably say there's lots of false endings, but when there's a real ending, that's when I kind of focusing on a title. I'm like, and the title helps me decide how when the painting ends.
You come back later and finish or stop again.
A few times, but not usually. No, not usually. I mean, at that time I just step out of, and I think if there are other ways the painting could have gone, if I can imagine other pathways I could have taken, I do another painting. I start another painting. Yeah.
In one of your paintings downstairs, you mentioned just leaving Jaipur. And then in your talk, you talked about multiples. And I got to thinking, in Jaipur, well, one thing I remember is the little streets with store after store after store of bangles, thousands of bangles. And I wonder if that would ever motivate you to do something like endless circles of color. I mean, it seems like something.
That's a wonderful idea.
That would be a great painting. I mean, with multiples, you can do all sorts of things.
That's true.
Sizes and colors.
Yeah, I mean, I think I never say no to anything, but, I am, no, I like that idea. I mean, I do pull from things, I do pull geometry from forms, from objects, and, but often they come from my own, they don't come literally from an object. So like, if let's just play this game and say, yes, I'm going to start a painting like that, I would probably do what I would do is I would just draw, and then those shapes might turn and morph into something. And then at the end, there might be some kind of latent or kind of like shadows of like those ideas, but you wouldn't be able to make like a direct correlation, perhaps to angles or things like that. It might be the fact that it's glass that might become interesting. That they're so beautiful, but they break also so easily. Like that might become actually a character, because I just think of the sound they make. Like you're thinking and I'm thinking, and the way the light hits them, and then they kind of like flicker. And the way they kind of like sound when they're on somebody's arm and they're moving. So like those conditions will become important. So when I respond to things, it's not always a visual, but it's kind of a sensory response that then gets iterated into the work.
Yes. I like the way you phrase that, it's a sensory response a lot of the times. How long did it take you to really gain, I guess, confidence in the middle space? That idea of sort of,
Well, I don't know if I would say I have confidence, but I feel like it's inevitable. For me, I think it's inevitable.
It's always going to happen. It's sort of like, because
I don't think you can.
I love the fact that there's this multi-layering, both of idea and formal applications, in the work. But it seems like it was something that evolved over your career too, to sort of gain this level of like decision making.
So maybe what I'll say to that is, and I hinted at this a little bit earlier during the talk, or maybe towards the end, when I was talking about the larger paintings, is this tradition is obviously very important to me. All different aspects of tradition of painting, Western painting, tradition of storytelling, tradition of like wanting to access a kind of theatrical space that I feel like I'm always thinking about, but trying to find a way to do it. Thinking back to my childhood, but on the other hand, what I'm find, I want to make work that is more about how the world is really now. It's like it just isn't as clean cut. So I think to kind of say like I'm going to settle on a type of genre, let's just call it that, or I'm going to paint figures, there is a certain comfort in that, and I never say no to that in a certain way, but I just wouldn't, it doesn't feel like that's who I am, or that's the painting that I should be making.
It also seems to me like you said it, you're addressing your time. Like the artist is sort of like, well, now I don't want to generalize, but in the sense of, where is painting now? Where are we going in terms of how we influence visual culture? Someone in grad school told me once, you got a lot of visuals to contend with today, right? We've got so much visual information out there. We're being bombarded with. How does painting change? How does painting make its own, carve into that wide spectrum of cocaine of stuff, that we're dealing with? And that's what I find really powerful in what you're doing, and that's the compliment. So I think the courage and the risk taking that goes into trying to make paintings like this, and that's why I said I know you're being humble when you say confident, but man, there's something really like pretty cool, man, about how you just go about with the freedom to play. I think that's something in my work that I'm kind of wrestling with today.
Thank you.
That wasn't a question, sorry.
So for people who have seen the exhibition and spent some time in the two rooms downstairs, I think that they probably keen into scale.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how you approach scale, how you determine that for each painting?
Yeah, definitely. Well, so, couple of different things. So I feel like I physically change. I feel like it's inevitable. I don't think the same experience happens in every scale. So that's one thing. So there are artists who are able to make the same image. Like they believe in the image. Above all else, they believe in the image. So because they believe in the image in a certain way, that they're able to shift between something this big to something that big, because the image is more important things might change a little bit. For me, when things change from here to hear or whatever. It's a bodily response. So the larger paintings, which, you know, I think of them as stagings, they're all taller. They're 7 feet vertical, which is a type of size that it feels life size when you're about 3 feet away from it. So there's a kind of a physical distance measured in terms of our body to that space. I think of them as something you can enter into, that they're open, and in that way that they're generous for the viewer, that they're inviting. So I think of them as, you know, I think a lot of like what it feels like to walk into one of those kind of incredible architectural spaces for every Durga Puja pandal, you know, and you just kind of move in there and it just kind of envelops you. When you get smaller, something shifts for me. Like when things become, and those smaller ones are more body size. I think of them as like between the, you know, chin and the hip, like kind of a torso size. So in that way, if you think about your own bodies, think about the distance that's measured between skin and skin, right? The front and the back. You know, you have this kind of layers of nerves and bones and muscle and tissue, everything kind of working together in such harmony. So I'm interested in that kind of compressed dimension. And so when those middle-sized paintings, they are about accessing really incredibly deep space, but within a shallower way. The other thing is I think of them as being compact, like contained. So if with the big paintings, I imagine what my goal is that they expand away from the frame. They're not about the frame. They're kind of the entry point, but I want the viewer to feel like it's enveloping, like it continues beyond you. It's like walking into a James Turrell. Like I think about him a lot in some ways. But the middle ones, I think of them as being more contained. So if I make kind of an aesthetic jump, I would say when I'm doing the middle paintings, in some ways I'm thinking about miniatures, books, handheld objects, things you give to each other. There's almost a transaction happening from our hands to the body and back and forth. But when I think of the bigger ones, I'm thinking about this, not just the head, but just the body. Like I'm trying to make where you can like smell, like, you know, like do you feel like did I just see that, or did I sense that, like air? So titles this brings up is often I talk about them as I'm trying to create atmosphere, or a kind of atmosphere is the wrong word, but a temperature. Like temperature is important to me, or climate is important to me. So, you know, inevitable question I often get sometimes about color, and I don't really think about color as much as I think about climate. And climate is complicated, right? It's like hot can be dry, Arizona. Hot can be muggy, like Texas or North Carolina or August in New York. You know, it can be rainy and hot. You know, so that kind of a more complicated weather pattern I'm interested in, as opposed to like sunny or like cold. Like they're more like there's more commas. You know, it's sunny and it's hot and there's some shadows, and you know, if you go in the shade, it's a little bit much cooler. You might need a sweater, and then it's Seattle, so make sure you dress in layers. And at night it might get a little bit colder. Bring a raincoat because it might rain. You know, because like that. That's like the day's forecast that you might see here. Like I'm like, yeah, I want to get that in there. You know, I don't want it to just be like. It's not like San Luis Obispo. It's like 75 forever and ever. It's like weird. Not going for microclimates. I'm going for like weather, you know. So yeah, monsoon, important.
Thank you again.
Thank you.